They told you the story was just about a poor family in the Appalachian hills, but that was only the surface. The real truth is darker. It is the kind of truth that was never meant for open ears, and yet here you are listening in the first breath of night to a secret carved out of bloodline and silence. Imagine standing before a house whose walls whisper pain, where the ground itself seems to resist every step you take toward it. This is where Brandon and Louise grew up, grandnephews of the infamous Whitaker bloodline, their lives shaped by a history so tangled and forbidden it bends the very definition of family. From the moment they drew breath, their fate was already set, not by choice but by design. The Whitakers were not just a curiosity for photographers or a bizarre subject for outsiders. Their existence is a living testament to what happens when isolation meets bloodline, when tradition collides with secrecy. Brandon and Louise were not simply children. They were heirs to a legacy carved out of broken decisions and institutional neglect, their childhood marked by abandonment. A mother who vanished, a father who disappeared into violence, and a grandfather who tried to hold the fragments together. Yet every step was haunted by the silent shadow of the family name. They would tell stories of sitting on porches as children, playing with toy cars while storms tore through the valley of hiding in houses that would later collapse under the weight of fallen trees, as if nature itself conspired to remind them that survival here is temporary. Brandon worked fast food to keep moving forward. Louise dreamed of escaping to Indiana, chasing opportunity while their peers drowned in pills and needles. But here is the hidden truth. The system never wanted them free. The cycle was always designed to hold them in place, chained by poverty, drugs, violence, and stigma. And yet within their story you hear echoes of something older, something carved into the very DNA of families like theirs for centuries. Isolation has been used as a weapon. The powerful know that when you cut a people off from the world, you do not need walls, you need only silence. The Whitaker story is not just Appalachia. It is a mirror of ancient corruption that teaches men to forget their power and live trapped in cages they mistake for homes. You are not just hearing their story. You are walking into the forbidden halls of control where family becomes a battlefield and survival itself becomes an act of rebellion. Brandon and Louise carried the shadow of a house that was never truly a home, and you can feel it in the way they speak, in the way their eyes drift when memory grips them. Their story is not only about poverty, it is about an inherited weight, a curse of bloodline and circumstance passed from one generation to the next. The Whitakers became known to the outside world as spectacle. But inside these walls, they were human beings surviving under forces that shaped them long before they were born. Louise spoke of wanting to escape, wanting to reach Indiana, where life might hold a different promise. But dreams like his were fragile, in a place where opportunity dies in the soil. Drugs hung in the air like smoke. Every corner whispered temptation, and every neighbor carried the scars of addiction. He wanted freedom, but the system had been engineered to keep him chained. Brandon took the route of labor coal mines underground, maintenance jobs, fast food shifts, nights where exhaustion replaced hope. Because when you are born into a valley like this, you are taught early that work is survival, and survival is the only glory. The story of their childhood is not random. It is evidence of a larger mechanism. Foster care tore them from their grandfather. On their 7th birthday, state agencies decided their fate not out of mercy, but out of bureaucracy and control. Brandon recalled how his grandfather once pulled a gun to defend them from abuse, how the line between protector and outlaw blurred in one single act. And what does that tell you? It tells you that institutions feed on fracture. They ensure that even when families fight to defend themselves, the law will twist it into further separation. But look closer. The same patterns echo in history, ancient dynasties that married within themselves to preserve power. Royal bloodlines cursed with madness because secrecy always consumes itself. What happened in palaces of kings now happens in valleys of coal towns, hidden from the world but born of the same design. Isolation breeds corruption. Corruption feeds control, and control sustains the system. Brandon and Luis are not just individuals. They are living proof that society maintains its shadows on purpose. Men like them become examples, whispered about, documented, then forgotten, so the machine can keep moving. You were never meant to notice the pattern. You were never meant to recognize that the cage is not theirs alone. It is yours too. Now you step closer. The air changes. You can feel the machinery of control humming beneath ordinary life. Brandon and Luis grew inside that hum. It is a mechanical silence that shapes souls, a system that teaches boys how to fold themselves into what it needs, not what they might become. Listen carefully, because this is where the lesson is not sentimental. It is structural. The valley is a classroom for containment. Poverty is curriculum. Neglect is the teacher. And every institution that claims to help quietly perfect the cycle of dependence so it never ends. Brandon learned to keep his head down, to listen for the opportunities that were half promises and half traps. He spoke of probation, of being pulled into the legal gears as a teenager, an arson charge that became a debt owed to a system that profits from their mistakes. Incarceration changed him in ways the camera could not fully name. Nights staring at walls taught him the vocabulary of fear. The world taught him submission, and he learned to perform it, work 2 jobs, take the shifts, keep the rent. This is the ritual of staying invisible. Luis watched his brother perform the ritual and made a private vow to leave, to push against the gravity that threatened to suck him into the same hole. Foster care appeared like rescue on paper, but in practice it is another device of erasure. Children shuffled like envelopes, identities parceled out and stamped with case numbers. The state says protection, but protection often means removal from the only anchors they had. Their grandfather, the Whitaker family, flawed and failing but real. The law separated them in the name of safety and left them untethered. When institutions step in, they rewrite histories. They cut threads that tether you to memory, and human beings become records in a file cabinet, not people to be rebuilt. And then there is the quiet complicity of nays. Hbers, once adversaries who tossed rocks at windows, later tourists asking for photographs, the same gaze that mocked, then voyeuristically adores. The public reacts in cycles of disgust, then curiosity. The spectacle is recycled. It fuels pity industries, charity pages where strangers donate, a GoFundMe that promises a house but not dignity, sympathy that arrives like a camera flash, bright, then gone. The underlying structures remain unchanged. The miners keep digging. The dealers keep selling. The courts keep processing. The valley keeps remembering and forgetting on cue. This is not just about 2 brothers. It is an anatomy of how societies keep their margins intact. The Whitaker line is a case study in intentional neglect, a lesson in how control morphs into culture. And when you recognize that pattern, you cannot unknow it. You begin to see the architecture of containment everywhere. In schools that funnel kids into trades, in courts that criminalize survival, in narratives that turn people into cautionary tales. Brandon and Luis stand at the intersection of these forces. They are evidence that when the world designs cages, lives will fill them in ways that break your heart and sharpen your vision. The further you descend into this story, the less it feels like a family history, and the more it feels like a blueprint, a manual for how control repeats itself generation after generation. Brandon and Luis did not invent their struggles. They inherited them. their lives scripted long before they could write their own names. The Whitaker family is spoken about in whispers, but the reality is louder than the gossip. It is a cycle written in blood poverty, isolation, and survival strategies that harden into identity. Look at the hills where they grew up. Those mountains are not only natural barriers, they are walls of silence cutting people off from the larger world. Outsiders came in with cameras and called it curiosity. But for the people living there, those cameras became shackles. No matter how far they tried to step, their family name pulled them back. The Whitakers are not unique, they are symbolic. Every culture has its outcasts, its families marked as other, while systems ensure that those labels never fade. When you study Brandon and Luis, you see the scars of an environment that demands silence. Luis spoke about Indiana like it was salvation. But salvation is a mirage when the same forces follow you through life, when your name itself is a weight. Employers whisper when neighbors watch, when even schools anticipate your failure. The cycle of being marked is a punishment that rarely lifts. Brandon tried to outrun it through work, through exhaustion, through disappearing into the crowd. But disappearance is only temporary because stigma always finds its way back. And there is a deeper truth here. Institutions thrive on these stories because they become warnings to everyone else. Step out of line and you will end up like them. Stay within your cage and maybe the system will let you live undisturbed, but never free. The Whitakers are treated as spectacle for entertainment, but in reality they are a reminder of how power maintains itself. Society creates its shadows not by accident, but by design. Brandon and Luis reveal how the so-called American dream has shadows that stretch farther than the eye can see. People tell themselves that freedom is accessible to anyone, but hidden histories like this show you the fine print. Freedom is conditional, survival is controlled, and those who do not fit the script are recycled into myth or forgotten entirely. The Whitakers were never meant to be understood. They were meant to be displayed as a warning, their humanity buried beneath the story outsiders wanted to tell. Now the pattern sharpens, and you begin to see why stories like this never disappear. They are not only about one family. They are echoes of something ancient, whispers carried through bloodlines across centuries. When you look at the Whitakers and at Brandon and Luis, you are not just staring at Appalachia. You are staring into the same designs that ruled royal courts and crumbling empires. Long ago, history hides it. But the truth is clear. Isolation has always been the breeding ground for control. Ancient dynasties married their own cousins and siblings to protect power. Kings demanded bloodlines remain pure, even as madness and deformity spread through their heirs. Egyptian pharaohs did it. European monarchs did it. Entire empires rose and fell under the curse of blood made too close together. What you see in the valleys of West Virginia is not separate from this. It is the same script performed on a smaller stage. Brandon and Luis are the inheritors of choices they never made, their fate sealed by a cycle older than they can imagine. But there is more. The very land they live on tells a story. The mountains hold coal, but that coal is a chain. Entire towns built around one resource, enslaved by its promise. Miners worked until their lungs collapsed, until their families were trapped in company towns owned by the very corporations that profited from their suffering. When those mines closed, what was left? Despair, poverty, and isolation. The perfect conditions for cycles of addiction and broken families to thrive. It is not coincidence, it is design. The Whitakers became a symbol, a spectacle filmed by outsiders and consumed by millions. But do you notice what happens when their story spreads? It is stripped of its context. It becomes shock value, entertainment for those who will never taste that level of poverty or abandonment. But underneath the surface, their existence is evidence of a hidden architect. You're the machinery of control that ensures some families are locked in cycles forever. The system is not failing them. It is working exactly as intended. So when you see Brandon pushing through 2 jobs, when you hear Luis dreaming of escape, you are not just hearing personal struggle, you are watching resistance against an ancient chain. Their very survival is rebellion because everything around them was designed to ensure collapse. The story is not only tragic, it is instructive. It tells you that power repeats itself in the shadows until someone dares to name it aloud, and now you are hearing it. Here the illusions begin to fall away, and what remains is not just family history, but the anatomy of psychological control, because cycles like these are not kept alive only through poverty or isolation. They are sustained through the shaping of the human mind. Brandon and Luis were born into an invisible classroom where silence was the teacher and shame was the lesson the mind learns early, that escape is impossible, and once the mind accepts it, the body follows. Think about the way neighbors treated them. Rocks thrown at windows, insults, whispered in daylight. Those words and actions were not random. They were rituals designed to reinforce their place at the bottom of the social order. Ridicule becomes a prison without walls. Even if you leave the valley, the echoes follow you, branding you as unworthy. And when outsiders later arrived with cameras, that same ritual was reborn, now cloaked in fascination. The gawking became digital. The spectacle turned into content, but the psychological impact remained the same. They were taught that their role was not to be seen as human, but as a warning. The brothers' childhood in foster care carved the same wounds. Luis and Brandon were moved like pieces on a board, stripped from their grandfather, and placed into an institutional script. Case numbers, hearings, reports. None of it ever aimed to heal. It was designed to normalize detachment, to train them to accept that belonging was temporary, and that love could be revoked at any time. This is not protection. It is programming, a subtle reminder that their stability depended on authority, not on family or self, and addiction, the ever-present shadow, is another tool of control in places like this. Substances are not only an escape, they are a weapon. They dull rebellion. They weaken community bonds. They transform grief into dependency so that entire generations are locked in survival mode, unable to rise above their conditions. When you flood a place with despair and drugs, you do not need chains. The people chain themselves. But here is where the mirror turns. What you see in Brandon and Luis, you also see in your own world. The methods may look different, but the principles are identical. Corporations feeding you, distraction, schools teaching compliance, jobs demanding silence, governments deciding who belongs and who does not. The Whitakers are extreme in appearance but ordinary in function. They are an exposed nerve that shows you what happens when control is stripped bare. Their suffering is not an accident. It is a reflection of a design that touches us all. This is the final descent, and it is here that the mask is torn away, once and for all, because what the Whitakers represent through Brandon and Luis is not only a family tragedy, but a mirror of the world you live in. You were never supposed to hear this part. You were meant to stop at the spectacle, the photos, the laughter, the pity. But if you have followed this far, you are ready to see that their story is the story of power itself. Understand this. The cycles of isolation, poverty, addiction, and stigma are not accidents. They are weapons. They are carefully maintained tools that keep entire groups subdued. Kings once used crowns and thrones. Now the rulers of today use policies, prisons, economies, and narratives. The pattern is the same. Keep the bloodline trapped. Keep the poor exhausted. Keep the outcasts visible enough to be mocked, but never visible enough to be understood. And above all, keep the rest of the world believing that it is not their problem. Brandon and Luis live within that design, yet their lives also hold something dangerous. They hold resistance because every time Brandon shows up for work, despite the exhaustion, he is rejecting the collapse written for him. Every time Luis dreams of escape, he is planting a seed that defies the machinery. Their survival is not only personal, it is symbolic. It whispers that even in the darkest design, a crack can appear, and through that crack light can bleed. And here is the secret that chills when you study forbidden history, when you peel back the layers of control from ancient dynasties to modern valleys. You realize that the cages have always been illusions. No cage survives once the prisoner refuses to believe in it. The Whitakers were never monsters. They were never curiosities. They were human beings used as mirrors for everyone else to look away from the real enemy, the system that thrives on silence. So when you leave this story, do not leave it as entertainment. Leave it as revelation. Remember that the whispers you heard in this valley are the same whispers that echo in your cities, in your schools, in your workplaces. The difference is only scale. The Whitakers are not the edge case. They are the exposed truth. And if you dare to carry their story as more than spectacle, you begin to see the world for what it is, a machine of control that can only be dismantled when its shadows are no longer hidden.